terms of AI, it's just everywhere. I think for some companies, it can be more of a marketing term versus specificity of what they do, but it's certainly transformational and it is being talked about everywhere in terms of creating efficiencies and companies being eager to leverage that here in 2025. So you've got so much experience around AI and ML. So discuss your experience there. What your perspective on the key challenges for execution, and what should executive teams be thinking about in terms of implementing AI?
Yeah, so obviously the AI landscape is changing. It's changing quickly, and every time it changes, it's changing by orders of magnitude in each iteration. And so I'm a huge fan of technology and always have been for 30, 40 years. And apart from the growth of the internet, I've never seen anything grow and change at this pace. Even if I look back at like how I was looking at AI and the things I was looking at a year ago, I mean, it's just dramatically different. The capabilities and the choices, it's all just in a huge state of change. And so I don't think that's any huge insight there. I think everybody knows that. And so I think the challenge is sort of understanding and dealing with that. And I think that part of the challenge is because it's changing so quickly, I don't think we're always, at least people that are outside of the developers of the technology, understand quite how much or quite the ways that things work in these artificial intelligence paradigms. Like if you give a prompt to ChatGPT or DeepSeek or Grok or any of these other ones, like, are you always going to get the same type of answer? Is it going to be consistent, or is it going to change? Should it be consistent? It's going to really depend on the context. And so I think that the fact that it's changing so quickly, the fact that it's not completely well understood to say 1 + 1 is equal to 2, and that a mortal person can kind of be able to comprehend and understand how these things are working are probably the biggest challenges. I think that the unpredictability of the answer, I think, is kind of the primary thing when you're talking in the context of medical devices and pharmaceuticals, or the use of these technologies and developing those kinds of things. And so I think that in addition to the challenges of understanding it and the inconsistency of answers, the protection of sensitive data, governance has been a huge portion of what I've worked on, and we can talk about some of those specifics, as well as the challenges of integration and long-term stability of these systems. And what works today might not necessarily work tomorrow.
Because it's changing so quickly.
I'm sorry?
Because it's changing so quickly.
Right. Maybe you spend millions of dollars getting everything aligned up, and then ChatGPT changes their API so that whole method or system doesn't work in the same way. And because the models are changing now, what you thought was a stable, consistent thing is not anymore. And that's okay if you're talking about creative endeavors or things like that, generating art. But when you're talking about perhaps giving advice to patients about how they should, that's maybe not such a great thing. And so I think that those are complex challenges that are not easily understood or addressed. And I think that the laws and regulations surrounding the use of these technologies, that's also changing in response to the changing technologies. And so again, we're talking about, in the best case, fines or warning letters or things like that. In the worst case, you're talking about maybe hurting someone or killing someone with the wrong application of this technology. So there's lots of things that, you know, I've I've worked on to address these challenges. I think the first is probably the governance aspect, to figure out, you know, in a company, to figure out what do we want to use these technologies for? How do we want to use it? What kind of guardrails are we wanting and needing to put in place to make sure that, you know, whether it's patient data or proprietary company data is not compromised as a result of these things. And so just establishing that framework is, it seems like it might be easy, but it's not, because it's sort of defining from a business process perspective to say, you know, who's authorized to make decisions about the use of AI? Can a manager say, answer an employee inquiry and say, yes, you're good to do that? Or does the manager need to gain approval and have insight from legal or compliance or, you know, any other discipline? And how does that all work? Who has to say what to who, and who gets to review it? And do we need signatures? And who's involved? Who's the ultimate authority? And once the thing is even put into place, you know, how do we monitor and make sure that it's staying compliant to these kinds of things, again, because it's changing so quickly. So these are just some of the challenges that I've worked on so far.
Now it is complicated. I'll never forget Christopher Lafayette, who's a regular keynote speaker and SME around the metaverse, around the whole aspect of that world. He was saying a couple of years ago at the MD um, West that he was the keynote speaker. And he was saying there are going to be people that spend millions of dollars on certain things they'll be pretty much extinct in a year, to, you know, to be really careful because of the technology that's in R&D, how far ahead of it was versus what's in the market right now. So it's certainly complicated, and but it's something that it's not slowing down. And I you and I talked a little bit about this offline, but the EU recently halted a bill that would have increased AI regulations around safety and liability, and they stopped it. There was a lot of concern around losing business and investment to less regulated industries. So they put a pause on it, and are, you know, I'm sure going to try to come out with something that more in the middle. But how do companies leverage AI responsibly while minimizing that risk to patients and caregivers? Because at the end of the day, I mean, I look at everything the clinical first. You can't just look at it clinically. You have to look at it as a business, or you won't be in business. But the number one priority should be safe, cost effective, with positive patient outcomes.
Yeah, it's a challenge for companies, because at the same time, yeah, there are all these risks and hard to answer questions, but at the same time, if we're not doing it, someone else definitely is doing it, and we don't want to fall behind on this. And so how can we, and you know, the same thing with the regulations is, you know, both from a US and OUS perspective, I think all the regulators are sort of saying, you know, we need and want to incorporate and allow these technologies, because if we don't, companies are going to just do it on their own without our consent. But how do we do it in a way that provides some amount of control, so that, you know, companies aren't just doing anything and everything, and that we've got a real crisis on our hands? Obviously there are no easy answers to these questions. I think, you know, a couple of years back, I think it was in 21, FDA put forward guidance about how to like a good AI ML practices guide, and it has the things that you would think about to say, like, you know, don't just consider the best case scenario, and make sure that the training and the test data are carefully selected, and that the model's tailored to the data that you have and reflects on the intended use, and make sure that the software development practices are following good software development practices. So all those things are good, but again, it's not so easy to implement all of those things. So the approach again that we've taken was first establish sort of a group of people to sort of figure these things out from the company perspective. Our company does this with this information, these products and whatever. And in our case, we want to have the following people make these kinds of decisions. Once that was done, that group of people started to talk about fleshing out what the specifics, who has to approve, who has to authorize, who has to review these things, and what the mechanics of that look like. And then once that's in place, then it's implementing those strategies across the organization to say, okay, anybody who's got an idea about using AI in the company, they're free to bring it forward, and it goes to this group of people to evaluate all the cross-functional risks associated with, and then a decision is made, and then it gets implemented. So that's how we've done it as a company. And I would say, it's hard for me to speak as far as the regulators and their approach, but I think they're taking kind of a similar approach as they're publishing guidance documents and saying, here are best practices, and here are things that have, paradigms that have worked in the past, and the same kind of methodology should be applied to AI. So,
yeah, you got an infrastructure in place with thought leaders that are tied into the success of the company, and obviously compensated that way. And so whenever idea issue around that comes in, you've got that infrastructure in place to look at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then come out the other end with the best decision from a risk management standpoint.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about leadership and career growth. So somebody that's earlier in their career, mid in regulatory or quality or compliance, who wants to move into a manager position, or maybe they've been in manager, director level positions, they'd like to kind of move to wherever. What kind of advice would you give to people through their, the leadership career path, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I've always told the junior folks who were reporting to me, is that, it doesn't take that long to learn the technical aspects of, what's required in a 510K or a PMA supplement, or in any kind of regulatory submission. I think those things are fairly easily understood, and there's guidance documents and things that you could reference to figure that out. The hard part is where the experience comes in, and to say, okay, there's maybe 3 ways to do this. What is the fastest way, and what is the most efficient way, and what's the way that's most likely to gain approval. And so that takes time and experience. And so I would say, I've had technical people working for me that sort of just assume, like, well, I know everything there is to know about 510Ks. I'm ready to become the VP of whatever. And it's like, no, I think you have to slow down and understand that, finding these solutions and being able to work from a cross-functional perspective is probably 80% of it, and the technical stuff is 20% of it. And so you can, but it makes life difficult if you go back to R&D or engineering or whatever you want to call it and say, well, we need this massive battery of tests, and we need everything double and triple checked, and that could be done, but at what cost, and how long is that going to take? And so being able to say, okay, here's what the regulators are looking for from us to understand what we're doing and understand that we've addressed the risk. That's not always easy. That takes the time to sort of understand. I think part of that conversation needs to be an understanding of how businesses run. How does sales and marketing, how do they work? What kinds of information do they take from the field and bring back? And what are their concerns? And so from a regulatory perspective, what can we do to understand those concerns, and what can we do to make our work align up with what they're trying to do. And again, that takes time and understanding. A lot of regulatory folks, they start working in regulatory and they're very focused on that, and that's good, but they're only looking at things through a sort of very narrow perspective. And I think having that broader perspective is really key to sort of being able to advance up on the corporate ladder.
So I two things that kind of immediately came to mind, and I'm going to ask you your take on the first one relevant to hybrid remote on site, because I think one of the things that has been lost on relevant to the pandemic, and in particular, I see this more with people earlier in their career, but really being focused on they want autonomy, they want to have remote positions and mentorship, and what you miss out on not being in the office. I just think there's a lot of experience and mentorship that's being lost when you're completely remote, particularly if you're earlier in your career. That could potentially be a detriment to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that, but I think there's also an element of, with the right people, I think that that's still possible to mentor and develop people remotely. I mean, I've done it, and I think if you said, can you do it 100% remotely? I don't think so. I think, is it required to be 100% in the office? I don't think so. I think that there is some amount of value to being face to face, but I don't know that the only way is 100% in the office every day. Like, I don't think that that's really necessary. I think early on, that kind of one-on-one in-person contact is really key. But then once that kind of communication has been established, like, there's no reason why ongoing discussions can't take place remotely. Like, I've had the same kind of success as with that as I have with in person. So
Yeah, and I think, like, in terms of what you just said, is it's like I don't think that genie's going back, and as you see some of these companies trying to move, and I wouldn't be an advocate certainly for certain functional positions being on site 100%. And that question was more around the earlier in the career, under 5 years, so to speak. But I think the companies that are going to have the most success, and the market went from a really candidate driven market to a company driven market with layoffs, investment capital. Obviously, the economy's been very difficult. A lot of talent flooded into the marketplace, so it's gonna move back. And as the economy and companies continue to grow, those certain areas where talent is hard to come by, they're gonna have options. And the companies that do the best job of creating mentorship and training and moving people around while not making them be in one spot. And if you're looking at San Francisco or Boston or New York, of your functional areas where you don't need them to be in a very expensive real estate space, and maybe even not have to pay them at the top end of a salary scale because they're in a lower cost of living place and they have the ability to do it well. Those that really do a good job of mentoring and having career ladders and employee appreciation in hybrid types of scenarios, I think, are the ones that are going to get the top talent.
yeah, I think companies see the working remotely as like it's just a negative thing. I mean, anything can be positive, anything can be negative if you look at it in a particular way. I think companies, they are going to have to figure out a way to leverage remote working. That's just the reality of the situation. They can demand it all they want, but I think, as younger people are coming into the workplace, they're just not going to do that, and they're not going to be bound by these sort of artificial limitations that existed years ago. And so they need to understand. I think it's been fairly well established, like, productivity can be higher with remote work. I think the part that is not necessarily well understood is, okay, how do we manage that? How do managers manage remotely? I think that's less well understood. Like, what's the best way to manage from a remote perspective than the fact that someone could do their work remotely? And so that takes time, it takes people committed. But I think at the end of the day, you know, just because someone's in the office doesn't mean they're going to be working. If they're going to be in the office goofing off, they're going to be at home goofing off. And if they're going to be at home goofing off, then they're just by coming into the office, that's not going to make someone automatically a player. So
Right, which is why it's so important to me. Again, hire for culture, personal why matches the mission and vision. They actually care and are passionate about it. And then how do you form your communication, your leadership, mentorship, also leadership training and career ladders, because annual voluntary turnover is 25% generally across all industries annually, and it's usually not the people that you want to leave. So having career ladders, having scenarios where you can be promoted not just vertically, but maybe horizontally into other areas. Because if you have somebody that fits the culture and they're passionate about it, and they have the crossover skills, they have other things that they're interested in, losing that person and then having to go through the recruitment, the training cost, the onboarding to replace them, and then the opportunity, this doesn't make any sense to lose somebody that fits the culture, that's a good employee.
yeah, and I think that, you know, people, it seems like a dumb thing, but like, do people understand how to work remotely? Like, that's not necessarily something that you're born with to know. Like, I have these tasks to do, and no one's necessarily breathing over my shoulder. And with that comes some responsibility on an employee's part to say, okay, when I'm done with that, or I hit a roadblock, that doesn't mean like, okay, now I put on cartoons and eat Fruit Loops. That there's a responsibility on my part to sort of say, okay, what else can I do? And that the remote work is a privilege, and along with that privilege comes some amount of, you have to be a little bit of a self-starter and sort of,
Absolutely. And I always said, I mean, I worked in an office my 12 years in corporate America for maybe 1 year, and the rest of the time I had home office and traveling. And I think you hire the right person relevant to the skill and their personal why, they're passionate. You actually have to make sure you set guardrails around them not working too much and burning themselves out. And that which is why employee appreciation programs, because um, those types of people are not sitting around. I heard something around with the government stuff that's going on, the people not being in the office, like part of the reason why they send an email out is because there are people that they're just not even answering emails. So the idea of like, give us 5 things that you've been productive in this last week, I saw that, I was like, you've got to be kidding me, because that it doesn't work that way in industry, where if you don't make a profit, there's no printing machine, there's nobody that's going to save you. So I think that's really well said. It's more around giving that direction and making sure you have regular engagement, knowing how people are doing. I think one of the first lessons I learned as a leader, that I really was not very good at a lot of aspects of leadership when I first got leadership positions in corporate America, but you have to make sure people understand what's expected of them, which may sound simple, but too often they may not exactly know. And so making sure that they're clear and defined outcomes that you're looking for and what's expected of them. But I think that's really well said. So as we come to the end here, where do you kind of see yourself? What are you open to? I know you're consulting again right now, but would you consider a startup? You've been at obviously large companies, you've done consulting, startup, mid cap. What are you open to in the future?
yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I think I'm a pretty open-minded person, so I don't necessarily have like, it has to be this type of discipline or this type of company or size of company or this type of role. I think I'm interested in all kinds of things, and my career has been, with a diverse set of products, classifications, types of companies, all over the board, and so I like that. So The stuff that I'm looking at most closely now is related to the use of AI in some way, shape, or form, whether the product has it or companies are sort of looking to leverage the use of it in the development or support of. So those are probably the things that are most interesting to me. I love technology. It's a huge hobby of mine. And so um, being able to incorporate that into what I do for professionally is probably the best win for me. That's at a super high level. I know it makes it harder to find things when you're very broad like that, but I keep an open mind about just about everything. So
Well, I think, obviously I think the size of the company, you can fit into any culture and size. But when you look at medical device, med tech grows 6, 7% CAGR, but robotic surgical platforms, monitoring, AI, wearable technologies, and where things are going, those are growing anywhere from 25 to 30% annually, and where investment dollars are going. So for companies that are ready to move to that next step, your ability to bring guidance over risk management, help set up the quality management system, really all aspects of that piece. There's so much value you could bring. So I wouldn't be surprised if you end up there, though. Wherever you end up, they'll be blessed to have you.
thank you. Appreciate that very much.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time, Mike.